morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. My name is Olav Kjorven. I'm the special, it's a very long title, so get ready for it. I'm the special advisor to the UNDP administrator on the post-2015 development agenda. In my hometown, if you go to the cemeteries, you see on the tombstones not only the names of the people that have passed away and the dates they were born and passed away, you also see their profession, like teacher or blacksmith. Usually that's the older gravestones. And I know for sure that when I pass away, my title will not be on the gravestone. It won't be big enough, and there will probably have been too many, because we live in a time when we move from one thing to the other. Our identity is not tied to a particular profession, and there's probably something good about that, but we might also have lost something in terms of pride and identity with a particular role in life. I don't know. But that be as it may, I'm very happy to be here with you all to try to kick off what's going to be a very, very interesting plenary discussion with some great people on the panel to introduce the different aspects of a very, very complex nexus of issues on water, on food, and on climate. And very pleased to have Jesse Hirsch with us, staff writer from Modern Farmer, to have Alexander Müller, senior fellow from the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam in Germany, and a dear colleague of mine for many years when he worked in the FAO, and I was also I still am with UNDP. Great to see you again, Alexander. Julie van der Bliek, who is advisor on program and business development, the International Water Management Institute, which I understand is in Sri Lanka, but you live in the Netherlands. Exactly. Iain MacGillivray, I got that wrong, I think, but I think he will be okay with me. Special advisor to the President, International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, in Rome, and Astrid, senior environmental specialist at the Global Environment Facility. It's really great to have all of you with us. I have had a sneak peek at their presentations, and I can promise you that you'll be nourished with some very important and interesting perspectives on the nexus of water, food, and climate. And a lot of it will be from the perspective of food, sort of anchoring it in what's happening when it comes to food systems, what are the challenges, and the linkages and interfaces with the issues of water and climate, and probably a few other things will come up as well. And at the end of it, when we've listened to these dense presentations, because they all have to rush through them in order for us to have time for interaction and discussion, I'll try to give some signals to you when I feel it's going a little bit too long and you need to wrap up, so that we make sure that we all have time to engage. But I can promise you all that you will be full of insights and questions by the time the panelists are done. If you think about it, the Millennium Development Goals, that was really the first attempt of the global community to come to agreement on a shared agenda. And by the way, an incredibly successful experiment it has been, because thanks to these 8 goals, we've seen unprecedented efforts around the world to make progress against these particular goals. But looking at it in retrospect, these goals basically represented a siloed social agenda. For the most part, it was a social agenda. And here we are, 2 years away from the deadline, or less than 2 years away from the deadline at the end of 2015, in the middle of discussing what should come after the MDGs, the so-called post-2015 development agenda, and all the talk is sustainable development goals. And what is that? It's a huge leap from the MDG framework, because we're talking about the social, economic, and the environmental dimensions that need to be part of this. Added dose of governance issues, even peace and conflict, violence kinds of issues, and a very strong consensus that this agenda needs to be an integrated agenda. So if you wish, the Nexus perspective is part of this. So it's a huge conceptual leap, and it means a huge leap in terms of the complexity, in terms of the politics involved in coming to agreement on something like that. But I think there's also a very deep recognition that something like this is in fact necessary and very, very important. This conference is very welcome for all of us working in the UN on this agenda, because we need all the input we can get as to what it means to construct a more integrated agenda and come up with more effective ways of conducting policy, the art and craft of policy making and the art and craft of programmatic support to countries to make the shift to that more integrated approach. But what I have seen in the Open Working Group, which I'm sure you've heard about, the group of 70 countries that has been meeting for a week every month for the last year, talking about the ins and outs of sustainable development, what I have noticed is that while the need for an integrated agenda is understood at a certain level, when you look at, and when you listen to the discussions and you will see, when you look at what has come out so far, the document that some of you may have seen with 19 focal areas, yes, interlinkages are very much recognized there, but you also can see that we have a long way to go. You see that as the discussion moves from topic to topic, from poverty to health, to water, to biodiversity, to energy, urbanization, to growth and infrastructure. Something happens. As soon as you start talking about growth and infrastructure, you're basically back in the old paradigm. It's very striking. What you hear representatives of member states say then is that we need growth, we need more pipes, we need more megawatts, and then, only then, and through that, can we deal with the different environmental constraints. And only then can we afford to invest in social progress. So what's still, I mean, it's very interesting to listen to the discussions when the member states are talking about biodiversity, when they're talking about water, when they're talking about urbanization, because then you notice that they have moved on, they have learned something, and they are trying to integrate at a certain level these very important issues. But there is a disconnect that takes place, which is almost cognitive, as soon as the discussion shifts then to, okay, what are we going to do to meet the infrastructure needs? What are we going to, how are we going to create conditions for redistribution and so on? The sustainable development perspective then, for some reason, gets lost. Now, I will sit down in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to just pose a few questions. And I know the panelists will pick and choose a little bit to what extent they will address them, but maybe we can have some of these questions in the back of our minds and get to them as we move through this plenary session. The first, to me, is looking at the post-2015 agenda And this Nexus perspective, how and where do we bring it in? Is it at the target and indicator level? There are different ways that can be done, and there are different proposals. And I've seen also in the draft declaration for this conference here some proposals. The problem is how do you bring this complex perspective in without losing the audience? Because what's been so great about the Millennium Development Goals is that they have communicated something to broad audiences, and they've helped mobilize action. When you bring in levels of complexity, you might lose the baby with the bathwater. And how much do we in fact get out of existing proposals, such as there are quite advanced proposals for how to factor different aspects of energy into the agenda, different aspects of water, food security. How much mileage in terms of integration do we get from what's already on the table? How much more do we actually need? Is it the Nexus or the Nexuses that we're talking about in this conference that is kind of the Holy Grail? Or is it perhaps actually more about integrated approaches to urbanization and to rural development? I think it's a very important question, because once you start to look at those broad issues in the aggregate, the consequences for how you pay attention to issues of energy, water, food, security, etc., might start to shift. Is it about doing policy and planning differently, and indeed is it about different approaches to collaboration in society across different stakeholders? Is that what we really have to look at, as opposed to zooming in on trying to get perfect, let's say, targets and indicators in the global framework? Do we indeed need to think about how we reinvent the very structure and fabric of government in response to these challenges? I think we all feel that there's something terribly lacking and problematic about the way central governments in particular are organized according to different sectors, when what we know we need is a much more integrated approach to spatial parameters. Those are some questions. You will learn much more from listening to this panel than keep listening to me, so I'm going to shut up right now and invite first Jesse Hirsch to come up and tell us what he has to say.
My name is Jesse Hirsch, and on the Nexus conference website, I do think I'm the only bio that has goats in his bio picture. I'm the staff writer at Modern Farmer magazine. We are a general interest agriculture magazine based in upstate New York. If you've never heard of us, that's because we're fairly new. We're about to celebrate our 1-year anniversary. We were started by a former New York Times Magazine editor, Anne-Marie Gardner. She was a lifelong city girl who recently bought a farm in the country. Our funding comes from one major investor, Canadian entrepreneur Frank Giustra, who's the founder of Lionsgate Entertainment and also a philanthropic partner with Bill Clinton. Like our founder, Giustra has also recently developed an interest in farming and sustainability. In many ways, Modern Farmer was a passion project for them both. As you likely know, it's a shaky time for print media, but our founders wanted to fill an important niche. Since its launch, Modern Farmer's goal has been to tell the story of food before it hits the table. There's certainly no shortage of food reporting in the current landscape, but the market is oversaturated with stories on celebrity chefs and trendy restaurants. Modern Farmer wanted to provide solid global journalism on the source of our food. This can mean many things, from stories on honeybee colony collapse to genetically modified papayas in Hawaii, from cattle rustling in Kenya to shellfish farming in Illinois. And we pepper the serious stuff with lighter stories, from pieces on farmers' favorite cocktails to how to milk a pig. It's kind of an unusual formula, but thus far it's proven quite successful. The target audience is anyone who cares where their food comes from. On one end of the spectrum, some readers have absolutely nothing to do with food production, but they're curious. These are the people who will ask lots of questions at the farmer's market, who when they go out to dinner, they're going to pepper their waiter with inquiries about the ingredients that their food came from. Then you've got the hobby farmers, people who have a few backyard chickens or maybe want some, or who are growing tomatoes on their fire escape or rooftop. And on the far end of the spectrum, many of our readers are full-time farmers, whether they're growing organic vegetables on a small plot in Vermont or they're fifth-generation cattle ranchers in Texas. I come from a background as a newspaper reporter and later as a food writer. In the past, I had written about farming pretty infrequently. So when I started at Modern Farmer, the learning curve was steep, but I quickly noticed a few themes emerging very rapidly. The debate over genetically modified foods, conventional farming versus organic, data mapping and other predictive technologies. But there was something else too, something I had not expected. My very first story for Modern Farmer was on invasive wild pigs and how rapidly they're reproducing and spreading throughout the world. Experts I spoke with told me that the growth of these pests was being given a boost by rising global temperatures. Another story I did early on was about last spring's floods in Illinois. As I started researching, I found that similar floods had been happening all over the world, from Vermont to Bolivia to Germany. These floods were extreme weather events, coming right on the heels of the severe droughts in the previous growing season. I did yet another story on a farmer who built a cluster of rice paddies in New York City. That farmer said it's much easier now to grow rice in the Northeast than it would have been a decade ago. 3 stories about very different things, but with one connecting thread. They're all pertinent to climate change. Modern Farmer's goals are not to mitigate climate change or adapt to its repercussions. As a media organization focused on agriculture, our mission is simply to help foster an informed dialogue among both food producers and consumers. On that mug up there, you can see we have a catchphrase. We like to talk about the weather. It's kind of a throwback to the days of the Farmer's Almanac, when old farmers would sit around discussing weather in the general store. And while we understand that climate and weather are distinct concepts, this phrase is a loose way of expressing one of Modern Farmer's biggest missions: to get information out there about our shifting global climate. We've already written dozens of stories that touch on these issues, both directly and indirectly. Let me give you a few examples. The Salinas Valley in California is often referred to as America's salad bowl. That's where Americans get about 60% of their lettuce. Currently, Salinas temperatures average about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But by the end of the century, researchers predict that the salad bowl will become a dust bowl. In this article, titled Super Lettuce, we look at the work of a geneticist named Baekwon Mu, who received a federal grant to study heat-resistant strains of lettuce. Since 2010, Bu has been working in the arid land near the Mexican border, studying lettuces that can flourish in high heat. The goal is to identify the hardiest strains, then isolate the survival genes. His work isn't cut and dry, so to speak. Some of the hardiest lettuces also taste quite bitter. So Mu is tasked with finding a good balance, likely through crossbreeding. Wine production is a very fickle enterprise. Optimal grape flavor depends on highly specific variables, most importantly, soil and climate. But the National Academy of Sciences predicts that by 2050, 70% of the land currently cultivated for wine grapes will be ill-suited for growing. So as our global climate shifts, more northern regions are finding themselves with growing conditions previously reserved for France and Northern California. Case in point, Russia. For many decades, the only Russian wines were so bad they had to be cut with sugar, mostly because of the growing conditions. But now, a Russian winery in the Cossack region is producing high-quality wines that have already won awards. This article also highlights other unlikely parts of the world that are now producing wine, from Denmark to northern China. Modern Farmer broke the news of the catastrophic blizzard that hit South Dakota in October, killing as many as 100,000 head of cattle. In a typical year, ranchers would move their cattle to protected areas in time for the winter weather, but no one expected 3 to 4 feet of snow in early October. This story was about one freak storm, but it was also about an emerging pattern of extreme weather events. We've written stories on the economic impacts of the drought in California, on entrepreneurs making bottled water from melting glaciers, and on what Obama's climate change speech last summer meant for farmers. Some of our stories are adaptation-oriented, like the story of the super lettuce. Others, like the piece on Russian wine, showcase a noteworthy shift in growing practices. And stories on the blizzard and the drought highlight some of the most severe consequences of our shifting global climate. In the US, farmers have proven to be one of the slowest groups to believe in climate change. Laura Lengnick, a lead author on the USDA's climate change report, and a source I use frequently for a lot of my stories, spends much of her time teaching how to farm more sustainably. She won't even use the word climate change when she's talking to farmers. We can talk about specific weather events and patterns, she says, but as soon as I mention climate change, they tune me right out. Lengnick's experience corresponds to what I've heard repeated over and over again by educators and members of the media. It can be hard convincing farmers that this issue is real, but the price of inaction will be far too high. At Modern Farmer, we feel like we're in a unique position to help shape the conversation. We intend to continue our intensive reporting on issues pertinent to climate change and resources. Without being preachy or dogmatic, we believe good journalism can show the undeniable necessity of adaptation. As all of you know, this conversation cannot stand to be delayed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Olav. So I will better not look at you so I don't see your signal. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Before I start, I would like to explain with 3 sentences what this very nice title, Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, means. It's a very young institute, only 3 years old, and it is based on the results of a symposium of Nobel Prize laureates where Paul Crutzen used the explanation of the Anthropocene to ask for a different kind of science. Not the science which has caused the problem or was part of the problem, but a science which taps all sources of knowledge from civil society, of course from scientists, from administrators, from all over the world, and tries to create what we call transformative knowledge. Not knowledge for transformation, we know a lot, but transformative knowledge, things we can really change. This was the idea of this institute, and I try to present why I think that working in a transdisciplinary way is very, very important for the Nexus. It's more than interdisciplinary. And I would like to start with a brief analysis of the current landscape of sustainable development. And of course, there are many ways you can present it. I have chosen the picture of mountains. Because what we can see is at all these global events, you have an issue, climate, you have a responsible international organization, UNFCCC, and they are dealing with carbon. You have a second mountain, CBD, Convention to protect biodiversity. They are dealing with species. Biodiversity is the issue. And of course, you have the World Summit on Food Security, dealing with food security, and they are working on calories. And it's very, very important to understand that this is a very solid construction. It's really like a mountain. It has a broad basis, it's very solid. They all have their mandate. There are a lot of institutions, there are governing bodies, there's support by donors. And if we want to make these people on top here working together, we have to have a very good idea, and we also have to provide support so that these people, these institutions, can achieve what they have to achieve. And therefore, we are talking about the global objectives on the one hand, carbon, species, calories, but at the bottom, things are interconnected. Every decision here has an impact also on food security and vice versa. And what I would like to do in the next 6 minutes, Olav, is to explain how decisions taken here will have an impact on all the other mountains, and even more. I have put only 3 here. So I'm going to climb up to this mountain and look at what are the challenges ahead. The first challenge in achieving food security, and this will be very high on the agenda of the SDGs in the post-2015 process, is that currently we have 2 targets. In red, the MDG target, who says we want to reduce the share of hungry people by 50%. And we are quite good on track here, dotted line. But there was also a summit in Rome, 1996, where it was decided to halve the number of hungry people. This is the dotted line, and this is the reality. So we are far beyond, and we do not achieve the target. The lesson learned is that we have to really define what do we want to achieve. From my perspective, it's very clear. Halving the number of hungry people is what we have to achieve, not the share. Every hungry person is one person too much, and we cannot hide behind population growth, because if population is growing, then the share will go down, and we have pockets of hunger in the world. We have not made any progress. And the Nexus has to learn the lesson that we have to define the targets in a very clear way. Otherwise, we are achieving the targets, but the reality is not changing. This is true, especially when we are looking at Africa. The MDG, halving the percentage, we are quite good on track, but the absolute numbers here are going up. From 1990, 178 million, of course that's an estimate, it's going up to 226 million people. So population growth helps us to hide the target or to achieve the target, but in reality we have a problem. And what we know is that the number of hungry people in Africa will continue to grow. And therefore, a Nexus approach has to take into account the hotspots of poverty and where we have predominantly hunger in the countries. There are different reasons. Now let's look at the challenge ahead. We know in the last years, soil, land per capita has rapidly decreased. With growing population, it will increase. This has far-reaching consequences. We have currently a loss of fertile topsoil of 24 billion tons every year only on croplands. This means 3 tons per person. And it takes a generation to build up new fertile topsoil. Currently, you can hide the problem, you can solve somehow the problem with fertilizers, but in the long run, we are losing ground. And now we have a growing population, we have less soils, so the question is how to manage soils in a way not only for food production, but also that it can contribute to stop changing the climate, that it can contribute to preserve biodiversity so that we have an integrated approach. And this means we have to do things in a very different way. But let's not underestimate the challenges, because all these silos, all these mountains, they have their mandate and they have to fulfill their mandate. And therefore I'm looking, and I put this chart in because we had a discussion about population. What do we know about the future? Here, this is the increase of population until today, and I'm using Olav UNDP's data from 2008. There is a later one, but this does not really change the picture. So what do we know about the future? If we animate it, we see that population growth rates will go down. However, there is a lot of uncertainties. We are always talking about the 9 billion in 2050. This is the medium perspective. The low variant means we will have less than 8 billion people, and then it will go down, and the high variant says we are going up to 12, 13, 14 billion people. So the question is, do we have policies, do countries have policies in order to ensure that one or the other variant in the end will materialize. And this has a huge impact on energy, on everything. And whenever people tell you we have to produce 60% more food for a growing population, please ask what are the models, the underlying models. And therefore, we have to think very broad and not to say, okay, it's growing, so we have to produce more, we need more energy and more water. Look at the underlying models here. One thing is very clear. If you take the medium variant from UNDP and you look until the end of the century, population growth in Africa will be very high. And remember, Africa is the continent where the number of hungry people has increased in the last years. So even if it's not 2.5 billion, only 2 billion, it's a huge increase of population according to what we know today. And this means that the Nexus approach has to contribute to solve this big problem. Latin America will grow very small, Northern America a little bit, Europe gets smaller, and Asia. So can we demonstrate that the Nexus approach is supporting food security, poverty eradication, preserving the environment in Africa? This is the key question. We have to offer support to the people who want to feed Africa, but we have to do it in a very, very different way. So let's look at the business as usual scenario. If agriculture continues business as usual, agriculture is the biggest user of water. 70% on global average of the water is withdrawn from the natural circle for agriculture. This is the perspective. Water requirements in 2050 is plus 5,500 cubic kilometers. This is the capacity of 55 effluent dams every year. On global average, it might be possible, but we have already water scarcity in some areas of the world. Along the River Nile, water availability is a question of peace and stability. So a business as usual scenario is not possible, and at the same time we have a growing population. This means we have to find an integrated way where Nexus can support what the different international institutions in fulfilling their mandate. The same is if we look at greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. This is the latest forecast from FAO. My friend Joseph Schmidhuber has done it. They have modeled the greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture. To feed a growing population means greenhouse gas emissions will go up. Now we know that poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa will be the first to be hit by changing climatic conditions. So there is an urgent need for adaptation, but the question is, will it be possible to adapt to a climate which is plus 4 degrees centigrade? Or do we have to do the utmost in order to keep to 2 degrees so that in the end we can do adaptation for small-scale farmers? And at the same time, agriculture is part of the problem, because business as usual means having more greenhouse gas emissions, hitting the poorest even more. And therefore, again, integration is very, very needed. The situation of the agricultural production systems today, based on a study, a state of the world's land and water resources, is already threatening. These are the areas where we today have land degradation. These are the areas where we have water scarcity today. It's, of course, not geo-reference, just to give you an overview. This means that in areas where we have very high population, we today already have problems. Nigeria, for example, rapidly growing population, land degradation, water scarcity. What does the Nexus approach have to deliver to support solving these problems and not damaging the environment even more or having negative impact on social issues? At the same time, the current food system is far beyond from being perfect. We put together the carbon footprint of food waste. And if we would consider food waste as a country, it would rank number 3 in the countries. Every year we are throwing away 1.3 billion tons of food in developing countries because there is no infrastructure, pre- and post-harvest losses, no processing facilities. And here you all know the situation in the developed world. So using natural resources to produce CO2 emissions is not a sustainable way. And if you look at water, food waste as a country would rank number 1 in the list of countries' water footprint for agricultural products. So we are throwing away water which we do not have in some areas of the world, and the Nexus have to contribute to it. And this is my final comment on the food system. Currently, in 2005, 2006, we had 844 million people being hungry, 13%. At the same time, we had 9% of the global population being obese. Business as usual means that by 2080, that's very linear, don't know if it will happen, we will have maybe only 150 million hungry people, but 2 billion people being obese. So we are producing more, throwing away 1.3 billion tons of food, and at the same time, I really have doubt that the health systems in the world, and Olav is giving very strong signals, will be able to deal with this growing obesity. So we have to raise the question, what are we producing for? What is the purpose? Are commodities the purpose to be traded globally, or is human health the purpose of production? I have an answer, but Nexus also has to contribute to it. So food has to be seen in a holistic way. Food security, its availability, access, stability, and utilization. We have to think it together. There's a little nexus inside the food nexus. And now I'm coming to my consequences for the declaration. The first consequence has nothing to do with my presentation. Simplify the messages. No one is going to read these 15 pages. This is a nice chapter for the next book of Felix Stott or a good annex, but we have to have very clear messages so that these messages will be heard in New York. Second, I was in a very positive way surprised by the presentation of Paula yesterday. Why shouldn't we say her approach, using the targets and dashboard approach, is very, very positive for the Nexus? Let's not try to develop something additionally, which then will be used in parallel, but let's try to go into the center of the debate and try to contribute to her approach. Otherwise, this is my big fear, Nexus will only hide the problem. People will talk about Nexus and do business as usual, so we have to go to the center. Number 3 is, despite all the support for Paula's presentation, there's a big concern about the sustainability of the natural resources. Not at global scale maybe, but at regional scale. So let's try to break down the planetary boundaries to the regional scale to know how much water is available in the different regions. I have missed in the document a human rights perspective. I strongly believe, of course people will say you cannot eat human rights, but these are the preconditions to really achieve food security for all. And there are other areas I don't have the time to talk about, but let's include the human rights perspective. One of the big questions I have is what kind of Nexus governance do we need? Let's avoid a situation where everybody is talking about Nexus and asks that the problems created by agriculture should be solved in the environmental community. We need more water, we have to produce more, so therefore the environmentalists should show how to better conserve water. This is not the Nexus principle. So we need a debate on the Nexus governance. And of course, the question is what kind of science do we need? This is nothing we can do with a gut feeling. We need a good scientific approach to it, but a different science. And let's not forget, in the end, it's a question, what is our understanding of sustainable consumption? There are serious reports that if we would like to come to a consumption pattern like in Europe or in the United States, we would need 2 or 3 or 4 planets. And this is definitely nothing which can be decided in New York during the SDG process. Thanks a lot.
I now give the floor to Julian, please.
Should have checked how this works. Will my presentation come? Next. There we are. Okay, so I'm Julie van der Bliek and I work for the International Water Management Institute. For those of you who don't know the institute, I'll very quickly explain. We're a research institute. We do research on water management, in particular water management for food production. But we do look across different sectors which touch on the food production sector as well, including energy, water supply, sanitation, and various other sectors. We're part of the CGIAR, which is a group of international agricultural research institutes. We work across Africa and Asia. That's IMI. I mean, we do also, the CGIAR works in Latin America as well. And we look for solutions for complex problems. And that's where I want to start today, because when we're looking at Nexus solutions, how can we address these complex development challenges? And I'm going to look at the Nexus from 4 different angles. One is bringing in the climate change, which was specifically mentioned in our title for this session. Second one, looking at synergies between sectors and within sectors also, which we think is important. The issue of efficient and sustainable water use, which was brought up a lot of times yesterday as well. And also the interactions between agriculture and natural ecosystems. So just to actually link this presentation a bit to Alexander's, it's nice because he took this global view, which we do at IMI also often, but I'm actually going to go a couple of steps down, and I'm really going to look here at what kind of solutions can we provide. And that links maybe also into Olav's question, is where are we going to find this nexus and integration? At which level is that going to be? And I want to also go back to that presentation by Paula yesterday, where she said we need to look at that level down, where we can look really at the integration of these different sectors. And so I'm actually going to invite you to take off those gray glasses, as she said, where we look very single sector, but put on our Nexus glasses and look at these different solutions, which I'm going to briefly discuss here. So first, looking at climate change. And we think, of course, obviously, we should be reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience and looking at different solutions to the present climate change issues, one of them being drought, where I think we all recognize that water storage is one of the key solutions to drought resilience. And we know that in a lot of countries where we work, the per capita water storage is very low. And there is a need and an interest also from the development banks to invest a lot into water storage. We've done a lot of work on this at IMI, and we strongly believe that when you look at water storage, you need to look at the full range. You need to look at storage under the ground, above ground, large scale, small scale. You need to look at who it serves, this particular storage, which sectors come in, but also what is the actual cost factor, what are the operation and maintenance issues around each of these different solutions. But lastly, also what we do think is that if you take a basin scale perspective, and I think that's crucial, and I'll be coming back to that in my presentation several times, you should not just look at one storage solution, but you should look at a complementary range of storage solutions. Looking at floods, the other angle of extreme events in climate change scenarios. Here again, I think what we're trying to say is don't look at floods in isolation. Look at floods and droughts, wet weather and dry weather in combination. And we're piloting this idea of underground taming of floods for irrigation, whereby we're looking at how upstream you can actually recharge groundwater with the excess flood waters and use this during the dry season for irrigation. So it's really looking at how you don't look at one solution, but you look at a combination of solutions, as well as looking at a basin scale, at the broader perspective. The next point I wanted to raise is looking at solutions where we can look more at synergies across and within sectors, where we can actually meet multiple needs. I'm looking here, for example, at the linkages between the water supply sector, the drinking water supply sector, and the water for food sector. And as we all know, multiple use water systems concept, MUS, is used at a lot of different levels and across a lot of different sectors. But here, just looking at it, if you would take a community perspective, in a community, people will have a range of different water needs, be it water supply for drinking, for productive uses like agriculture, livestock, brick making, whatever. They will also have a number of different water sources. How can we integrate these needs and the management of these water sources and also economize on that during providing infrastructural support to these water needs? So I think it's looking at the synergies between the sectors and being able to economize on that. Another angle is looking at sanitation, use of wastewater, and food production. So it's a reality in a lot of the countries where we work that wastewater streams in urban and peri-urban areas are used for food production. Authorities may not like it. They may think it's small scale. We know that it's happening a lot. And actually we think it's an opportunity. It is an opportunity to make use of these relatively secure sources of water, including nutrients. However, the way how you do it, of course, and whether you make sure that the health impacts are limited, the negative health impacts, that is the important part. Now, if you look at the SDGs, which are being proposed at the moment, or the various proposals of SDGs, they all look at water pollution and water treatment. And I think from our perspective, we would really like to argue that when you look at water treatment, in particular in a lot of countries where we look at decentralized approaches and treatment for reuse rather than full-scale treatment. And we think there are a lot of gains to be made there. And that's, again, because you're looking across sectors and you're looking at multiple opportunities and benefits. Apart from that, I mean, there are a number of other energy or Nexus benefits like energy reduction and other environmental benefits, which could also be taken into account. Now, going on to this discussion of efficient use of water and a sustainable use of water, which again comes into the declaration, comes into the SDGs, and was raised a lot yesterday as well. And what we see is a lot of the emphasis is very much on water-saving technologies, in particular fields or areas, without taking into account what the basin-level impact of this is. And I think what we want to stress here is that while it is extremely important that we explore these water-saving technologies, we should also take a broader look. And if water is saved in one field, did that actually mean that water is also saved in the basin, or was that water used elsewhere? Maybe water that we thought was wasted, it was actually used to recharge the aquifer. So again, it's looking across sectors, across scales, which would provide better solutions. I'm going to give another example. This is actually a rather complex example, and I could spend an entire presentation on it, but I can't do that now. This is looking at groundwater use in India. I think we all know that in India there's a lot of overutilization, overexploitation of groundwater. In particular, if you look at the northwest corner and in the south. And we've worked a lot with the Indian government by providing policy recommendations on how they could actually deal with this, in particular in areas like Punjab and Gujarat. And I won't go into all the details, but it's the solutions which we found and which actually were implemented by the Indian government and which led to water savings and more sustainable use of groundwater, plus increased agricultural production, were outside the water sector. They were in the energy sector, they were in the agricultural policy sector, and it is crucial that we do look for out of our box into other sectors, how we can actually provide incentives for farmers to use less water. There's a lot more to tell about that, but I won't do that now. My last point was looking at this linkages between agriculture and natural ecosystems and the many services that can be provided by ecosystems. We have a group of colleagues at IMI who have been working for years together with the Ramsar Convention on wetlands and others at looking at how poor people, tens of millions of poor people in the countries where we work, make use of wetlands and for their livelihood, and whether it is food production, fisheries, storage, various other usages. It is a crucial ecosystem which they make use of for them. And we've been convincing and discussing with the Ramsar Convention that sustainable use of wetlands is the way to go in the future, because we realize obviously there will be an impact on the ecosystem services, but if you look at the trade-offs and the benefits, you should be able to find a way of managing these wetlands and still providing a number of important ecosystem services for the future. Taking that a little bit further, and this is my last slide, just another concept which we're working on with IUCN, which is looking, and I think this came up also in a discussion yesterday or day before yesterday, looking at natural infrastructure as opposed to and complementary to built infrastructure. If you look at the, let me see if I can get this, is this If you look at the natural basin here, you'll see that there are a number of services provided by a natural basin, but not the crops, hydropower, and industrial. So if you look at how a lot of intensively utilized basins are, the services which they are providing, where there is, for example, irrigation infrastructure, dams, other infrastructure, obviously these services go up incredibly, but at the same time at the detriment of a number of other very important ecosystem services. So what we're looking at really is how can you look at a combination of natural built infrastructure to make sure that you still have the range of services that you require, and all at a level of trade-offs that you still keep the important services in place. It's not very well said, but I hope you understand what I mean when you see the picture. So this is my last slide, and I think this is also where I want to end, because I think this sums it up in a way. And I think if we put on our Nexus glasses and we take this view of looking across sectors and across scales, we are really able to identify opportunities which will give solutions with multiple benefits. And I think that's where I want to give my contribution to Olav, that I think at the level of solutions, I definitely think it's possible as long as you open up those boxes across sectors. And I'm not very sure at the level of goals, but I think this is where we certainly should head for. Thank you.
Brilliant. They're so good at keeping time, these people, I don't have to milk the cow. Now it's Iain, please.
Okay. Hope you're ready for another presentation. I'll try to be brief. This is certainly a welcome opportunity for us. We've been so beautifully welcomed here at the university, and we thank you for that. And for those who have organized this Nexus conference event, it is an opportunity for us to share our views. Some of them will be a little bit different, but certainly an opportunity for us to listen to you and to learn. For us at IFAD, this is a critical moment. We're at the stage of replenishing our funding. We're looking at a new vision, a new strategic framework, and not the least, we're inserting ourselves in the debate of the post-2015. At IFAD, we invest in rural people. And when we say that, we refer to the more than 2 billion people who live in the rural areas, the women, men, and children in developing countries that depend on smallholder agriculture, forestry, livestock, fisheries, aquaculture. And hence what we see as the custodians of the vital natural resources and biodiversity, and they are central to climate change mitigation and adaptation. The crafting of a new global development in the post-2015 for us is a unique opportunity to refocus policy, investments, and partnerships on inclusive and sustainable rural transformation. Without this, rural-urban inequalities, we feel, will deepen. Cities will struggle, and global food security will be at risk. Conversely, rural transformation can be a powerful engine of sustainable development in all its aspects, from economic growth to poverty eradication, from a healthy environment to inclusive societies, from gender equality to food and nutrition security. This is what we'd like to share with you, and our 4 clusters of issues that are of universal resonance. While not covering the whole rural development agenda, they provide a map of areas where catalytic action may be inspired by new goals, targets, and indicators adapted to different country circumstances. The 4 issues around which the Sustainable Development Agenda can catalyze rural transformation lie within the rural space, and there we talk of leveraging the rural-urban nexus for development, and we'll get into some detail. The second one, focusing on eradicating poverty of rural people, and we look at empowerment, the empowerment agenda for these people. Third, agriculture, food and nutrition security, which is what we focus on at IFAD, investing in smallholder agriculture for global food security and nutrition. And the last, resilience and sustainability, promoting the resilience of rural livelihoods. Why is this so? Because what we want to do is move away from a conception that says that rural communities, the rural space, the rural areas are the synonym of backwardness, of marginality, of poverty, and the only function that the rural areas, the rural space, is to shed labor, so that this labor will feed the urban slums in these growing cities, assuming that these urban slums can really work in isolation from the rest, and that nobody will feed the consumption markets, and that they don't need environmental services, most of which will come from rural areas itself and will depend a lot on how natural resources are managed in these rural areas. So it's like saying we should not delude ourselves. If migration is going in one direction, remittances we know are going in the other direction, and there is a whole missing middle where it is composed of small towns, cottages, industries, value chains that are formed in landscapes which represent a continuum between rural and urban areas. So there is already a lot of osmosis that goes in between, and it's not fully recognized. And we feel that we should try and reconnect the rural areas with the urban in much more of an interdependent way. Clearly, we cannot afford to be in a world where cities are assumed to be sustainable if countrysides are not. So this is basically the bottom line. You cannot have sustainable cities if you cannot have sustainable countrysides. Can we risk or afford to be in a future where rural-urban inequalities keeps on increasing, have polarized societies, undermined social fabrics with divided families, men migrated, women stay at home with the kids, disgruntled unemployment, youth, social unrest, degraded environments, pockets of poverty, no rural infrastructure, insufficient food supply? This cannot possibly be the future we want. The future we want is a future that really looks for a sustainable rural-urban nexus, where we focus more on rural towns and local governments, where it's possible to work on the farm or live in nearby towns. But this will require investments in infrastructure and services and more, financial inclusion, particularly through ICTs, leverage the huge amounts of remittances, which is what we're already doing, that are going back to rural areas from urban centers. It is also the place that will generate food security and value chains, because they will feed the cities after all, and potentially, and of course this is the question, they will absorb also the youth and the unemployed, and absorb a greater number of them, and they present an opportunity for them to stay in rural areas with employment opportunities rather than just go to the cities. And we've seen the limitation of cities and their capacity to employ youth. So clearly the rural areas have to be put to contribute to this. So it is an area where we are talking about sustainable landscapes and at the same time sustainable peoplescapes, because the two really go together. This for you, I imagine, knowing food security and agriculture, is pretty straightforward. There are 500 million family smallholder farms in the world, and they represent between 2 to 2.5, maybe more, people. Most of them are poor. About 800 million of them are undernourished, and we know that 75% of extreme poverty is rural, 25% is urban, And we also know, and this is widely documented, that agricultural growth is twice as efficient in reducing poverty than other types of growth. And we know that agriculture is mostly a smallholder business. So if you resolve this equation by the variables it contains, the solution to that equation is that improving smallholder family agriculture is the closest proxy you can find to reducing global poverty and hunger. And the graph illustrates the numbers in extreme poverty, both rural and urban. So what type of agenda is this? We believe it is an empowerment agenda. It's to demonstrate the power of voice and scale. It's about both social empowerment and economic empowerment. Under social empowerment, we have their own organizations and collective action, building social capital and trust at the community level and at the group level, securing rights and access to services, to assets, respect and equality, particularly for ethnic minorities and women. Under the economic empowerment, it's more like ensuring access to productive assets, whether they're land, livestock, equipment, technology, financial inclusion, whether it's savings, credit, insurance, warehouse receipts, remittances, and helping them go into scale and aggregation. This is an important agenda. Voice and scale will bring our producers to our people and our rural people at the forefront of the capacity to negotiate with government and with the private sector. And for this, the bottom part of our slide, we insist on what we call institutions of the poor. And we say of the poor because we have had far too many institutions for the poor. We have identified three main entry points: affinity-based savings and loans group. The second entry point would be assets and market-type groups, which bring cooperatives or the commodity-based groupings. And the third entry point could be resource-based groups, like the water user associations that we see in irrigation and watershed committees or other types of committees. The bottom line really is organize, 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 bringing people to scale and graduating them. And you can't go wrong in organizing people because power is voice and scale for them. We said that smallholder family farms represent about 2.5 billion people. So if they can feed themselves nutritionally to start with, almost half of the problem is solved. Now the real question for us is who is going to feed the rest? The 9 billion people that will be in the world by 2050. And this is where we at IFAD take our bet. And we are basically saying that it is not going to happen without the contribution of smallholder family farms. And why is this possible? First, because we see revival of the agricultural sector. Maybe it's just prices, but you see prices have gone up in a structural way since 2008. And since the food crisis, this has totally changed the way we look at agriculture. And not only we, the private sector, as we heard yesterday. The private sector is on the move and has understood that they need to move in this sector for their business to thrive. This is the end of cheap food, said The Economist a few years ago on the business page of the International Herald Tribune. Now make time to shift from gold, platinum, and agriculture is seen as the next areas of demand. I'm sure many of us never thought that agriculture would be equated with gold and platinum. Well, this is where agriculture is now, and the private sector has seen it, and that's where they're going. So we are probably close to a historic opportunity, reduce poverty, ensure global food security through market-driven smallholder farming. However, there are two caveats. And that agricultural productivity agenda is the one that we've just seen. And we need to be smarter in two areas. And we're working on both, to be nutrition sensitive and to be climate smart. But how is this possible that the private sector will be willing to engage with the smallholder community? Well, this is what is referred to as the bottom, business at the bottom of the pyramid. If this pyramid represents smallholder populations, we know that the private sector is going down the pyramid. But so far, they've been able to engage with the commercial segment of that pyramid, but they clearly want to go down. But the more they go down, the harder it gets, because the transaction costs are higher and higher as you go further down. As we know, the public sector is going up the pyramid, working mostly with subsistence agriculture, and it is in the middle where we call the viability gap, which is where we really like to attract the private sector, even if we know that this is not going to be obviously or intuitively easy for the private sector to do. However, we are convinced that the biggest untapped market, and this is also where the largest potential of productivity gains are, but it's a kind of special market because it's low cost, low profits, high volume market, so you really have to go to scale. If you don't have scale, it is extremely hard for the private sector to go down this pyramid because they need volume. Without volume, it's almost impossible to do business with small, isolated, dispersed farmers. So this is really the 500 million smallholder pyramid. It's a huge market. We are talking about 2 billion people here or more. And not only are they producers, they are consumers. So what can we do to fill this viability gap? We can reduce transaction costs for doing business, finance the public and semi-public sector through business plans, to encourage this public-private producer partnership through business plans, where the private sector and producers will pair together and through the intermediation of the public sector to finance business for the public and semi-public goods are concerned. We work with governments in countries. The third one would be to leverage value chain financing through the private sector and financial inclusion, meaning asking the private sector to do a little bit more than being a buyer and a little bit more than an investor, to be a bit more than an investor. And lastly, promote responsible private sector investments. When one hears the word responsible private sector investments, it talks to land grabbing issues, for instance, and there's a lot of discussion about this within the World Committee of Food Security. Lastly, on resilience and sustainability. So why do we think that smallholders are key to this issue? Well, whether one likes it or not, the smallholder farmers are the managers of most of the world's natural resources. And we're talking about land, water, forest, fish. They sit on it and they manage them. So the search for the Nexus solutions will need to involve smallholder farmers. Unfortunately, smallholder farmers are both the unwilling victims and culprits of most of the changes, particularly the climate change you see right now. We know that agriculture and environment have been friends, but also foes for a long time. Agriculture to grow needs what the environment wants to protect. And so here, there is a huge agenda of trade-offs, but also unmet synergies and unmet opportunities, because it is still possible to have win-win solutions where you can still increase yields and manage natural resources properly. And we know that climate risks, we have started to understand the impact of food supplies on food security, because we know that shocks on the food supply system can have multiplier effects on price shocks. Conflict and also poor governance. If you are a poor person and you affected by corruption by officials, this is a shock. Sometimes it's something that can have deal with, but because you are poor, you're likely to lose most of your resources and can set you back decades. So how do we cope with shocks and externalities? Well, probably through various ways. To build resilience of grassroots institutions and their social capital and their own institutions. But also we need to do better risk management when we plan our interventions or when we design our projects. To be more conscious of what the likely impact is of possible climate shocks or price shocks could be. So we have to be a bit smarter in terms of innovation and technology, which may be actually generated locally, and much of this technology may actually already exist. We need to devise better price and ecosystem risk management tools, and we need to be looking at sustainable agriculture from multiple benefits point of view. This really means that agriculture is really much more than calories it produces.
It's about landscapes, it's about people, it's about the style of living and about social capital and about the environment. And really we need to look at agriculture differently and give it more credit than we have in the past. The other two main areas to refer to are specifically two programs that we've developed at IFAD, and one is the Adaptation for Smallholder Agricultural Program, where we're mainstreaming climate change in our full portfolio. And the second one is the Platform for Agricultural Risk Management, which we launched very recently, and also provides an opportunity to look at the generic risk management issues in a holistic way in selected countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So lastly, for IFAD, a future where smallholder family farming is at the center of our agriculture, economic, environmental, and social agendas is key for promoting equitable and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain, for that incredibly rich and interesting and powerful presentation. Thanks so much. Last but not least, Astrid. And I do hope we will have some time for some interaction afterwards. I'll ask for permission to go a little bit beyond 10:30, so we can maybe have a little bit of a round of questions and answers, if that's okay. Astrid.
I'll try to find my way around the technology here. There we go. Good morning, my name is Astrid. I'm coming from the Global Environment Facility. So, needless to say, the Global Environment is a facility working with 12 implementing agencies, which are traditionally development agencies. The SDGs and working within the planetary boundaries are close to our heart. So how can we combine and how can we look at it and the twin objective of global sustainability and poverty eradication? While the MDGs, they're clearly useful to bring the poverty agenda forward. They're mostly people-centered, which is of key importance and we cannot lose when we're formulating the SDGs. But we need to reconcile growth into growth within limits, within the planetary limits that are given. So as Paula also mentioned, we need to take away the myth of the renewables and things we can recycle and we can keep on growing without looking at these planetary limits. So we need to look at the net, I believe. We need to look at the increase in water, food, and energy and access for the poor. Yet we also need at the global scale to look at the limits of growth. Alexander came through some numbers which are probably most pertinent to bring up here. The food productions, if you look, we need to go up by roughly 70% in the next 40 years. At the same time, right now, we are wasting about a third of the food that is produced in the world. A third of the food. It's 1.5 billion tons a year. So you need to put that in perspective. Achieving SDGs and growing within limits, therefore, this whole process of formulating them but achieving them cannot be a government process anymore. Both the private sector and the middle-class consumers and the growing middle class are involved. Both North and South, I think, walking forward on the SDGs will have a much more action agenda and much more actions to take and targets to achieve. It's truthfully not a government process. So let's look at those planetary boundaries. And yes, of course, from the GF and being working on the global commons and being the larger financier, we are looking at the integration, and we need to, in order to move forward. Sad to say, the planetary program is the raison d'etre that the GF was created in the first place, around the Rio Summit, and it's the global mechanism to finance action on biodiversity, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and land degradation, forests, and chemicals. And you look at the international waters space, international waters focal area, it's not governed by any one convention anyhow at this point. We are already stepping into that messy space of having to integrate. International waters, you're dealing with overuse of the fresh water, we're dealing with chemical pollution, we're dealing with the disruption of nitrogen cycles, so we're dealing with a lot of these planetary boundaries that are already hitting their limits. Then you add to it ocean acidification and biodiversity and other ones that are very closely related. So we have been trying to deal and having to address that quite all along. So I'm also very much appreciating that climate change has been added to this Nexus formulation: water, energy, food, and climate. And I will add a few more when we're coming down the line talking about it. So I care about transboundary waters when talking about the Nexus. Most of water on this earth is transboundary. Around 276 river basins, and we're counting up, and even more groundwater basins. And most large marine ecosystems of this world are really truly shared by more than one country. So you cannot go around looking at international waters and cooperation on waters. Half of the world's land surface, 40% of population live in river basins that are shared by more than one country. Water stress is increasing, and I think if I even would put up a map on water stress around the world, it's not telling the story, because it is not only that absolute average of water stress in a country, it's the variability that is increasing. And we already have large variability from season to season, from year to year, and within the country. And when you look at that stress that comes then increased by climate change and changing precipitation patterns, we are adding to these pressures on international waters. Add to that the pollution story. 80% of the world's treated wastewater is discharged untreated. Collected wastewater is being discharged untreated. So add to that the non-point source pollution and the water that's not treated at all. So then we're looking at the freshwater marine interaction. So the Nexus can not only look at the freshwater space, we also need to look what is the interaction with the receiving bodies of water. So let me talk a little bit on the International Waters Focal Area that was created in 1995, and its goals, Nexus or not, climate or not, have not changed, because it has always looked at this intersectoral linkage and looking at the trade-off between sectors and across boundaries, and that has been important. So let's keep just a few pictures up, because when we are looking at the Nexus in the transboundary context, the needs of countries for water, for food, for energy, and the water for people, and the ecosystem services is, after all, underpin these water flows, are common concerns for the well-being among countries, and therefore these are the basis to cooperate and to have a dialogue among them. Each country needs water for all these Nexus dimensions, and therefore, may I also say, in the GF new programming cycle, we added ecosystems to the Nexus. So we call it water, food, energy, ecosystem security Nexus when we're looking at the Nexus programming. So if we believe that ecosystems underpin all of these functions, we do need to make this explicit, and I would tend to promote that we add that to this Nexus formulation. In basin development, the Nexus approach requires intersectoral cooperation, intersectoral committees on national scale to look what should happen on a basin scale. This adds complexity to boundary governance. And while it has worked when I'm looking at the GF forward on national scale to bring practice together, it remains a challenge on the basin scale. I think Olav mentioned it before. We're talking a lot about Nexus, but have we seen it in river basin organizations? Have we seen it in large marine ecosystems commissions? That they're really carried by more than the water sector. How do we get transport, energy, agriculture in these basin cooperation and in the institutions that underpin them? It's not easy. And we'll probably have to step out of that space, which is already difficult, into getting regional economic commissions more on board and looking at regional power pools, because the energy sheds are larger than the water sheds. So we will need to deal with that. Cooperation on international waters takes trust, and exactly that's where the GF sits and has stepped in this space, catalyzing cooperation processes and facilitating legal institutional frameworks for cooperation, and encouraging the sharing of benefits and not only the sharing of water to move forward. Engaging countries in common fact-finding, getting together, what is your reality, what is my reality, is usually the entry point to the whole thing. Because if you look from a basin from the top and you look from the bottom, your reality and your perceptions are probably different. Your data seem to differ what the issues are. So that is one space that needs to be done. And then agreeing on ministerial and high level and best on several ministries on an action program. Only when countries cooperate in that way and looking at a basin or an ecosystem as a basis, not by country, we can come to these Nexus solutions that are optimal. We need to look at where is the best space for infrastructure for food, by geography, by climate, by water availability, by soils. We need to look at where is the best space for energy. If we would look at it country by country and by the logic, it would definitely look different than when you look at it from a multi-country scale. So only on that cooperation scale it works, but it just takes trust and it takes time and it takes working with your neighbor, and it's not done with data and just looking by logic. So cooperation needs investment. Cooperation has costs. It's not an end in itself. So we will, I think when we're moving in this direction on Nexus on a baser level, you need to step in getting countries together, but you also have to have the carrot of, where does it get you? Because otherwise it's not an end in itself to cooperate. It does have transaction costs. On the other hand, investment needs cooperation. Nobody, and why? Because of the impacts upstream, downstream, inland, freshwater to the marine, but also because of investors and raising finance. Which investor, which financier, if it's private or public sector, will want to step in a space where countries don't cooperate, where your investment will cause conflict. So in that sense, water can be a uniter and it can be a source of tension. But most of the time, water is your basis where you start to cooperate. Why? It makes economic sense. In the end, it makes the more sense to countries. And the more we see and we can support this dialogue, the more we see the linkages among sectors, the interaction on business scales to share these benefits, I think the more you will take down tensions, the more you will see dialogue and the less explosion into conflict. So I think the Nexus dimension has that too. It has water for food, people, and energy. It has sustainable growth, and it has the water for regional integration, stability, and peace that you get in there. I will very briefly only go over and see how do we get there, and a little bit, our little microcosmos of the GF, which is, obviously a small player in this world. On what does it take to come to these integrated approaches. Just one example, legal institutional frameworks, I talked about it. They're critical for cooperative management. In the case of the Benguela Current, it's the first large marine ecosystem-based cooperation, and the commission was created last March, undersigned. The Strategic Action Program for Investment I talked about before that, Jeff was lucky to help to realize was signed at least by 3 ministers from each country. That took a decade of time. It's not easy to do. Integrated approaches, I talked about that before. We need to work on the local scale to make people see benefits from cooperation. You need to work on a regional scale to get countries together, and you need to work on a global scale to have a vision on how to bring things together. And of course, you need to look at, well, if you only optimize on the freshwater, what's happening on the receiving water end? So we do need to carry the nexus across the freshwater space. Program approaches. You cannot just work on a project-by-project pace, even if you try within the project to look at the different sectors. So when we look, for example, at the Danube, the issue of the dead zones in the Black Sea, pollution coming from the Danube River coming in, it took more than designing project. It took a program, it took a vision, it took something that you countries united and knew where they wanted to go to integrate that, and it took a coordinated approach that countries and financiers, development partners bought into, and it had great success. Reactive versus proactive. We are seeing groundwater being used much more for food production. We will have to up the ante to look at conjunctive management and on governance of these unseen resources. The invisible gets much less attention to governance because it is much less urgent for the moment, but once you reverse the trend later, it becomes much more costly. So being ahead of the curve there will be certainly something we need to take more attention on. Be a bit daring, innovation. I think we will have to step in the space and fail sometimes. And you're looking at new technology. Here it was new irrigation technology that was based on a new allocation system to look at evapotranspiration as a way to allocate water down to the farmer level. And it was successful. You got the triple wins of improving livelihoods, getting more money to people, reducing the water use and getting more water into the Bohai Sea, and reducing the pollution at the same time. But to be daring on technology, this is a nice story. You also have to accept when you do, coming from the finance institute, you will fail. You need to take risks, and you need to sometimes live with failure. This is just a placeholder. This is a project that we support on supply chains. And this is coming back to when we want to look at SDGs and sustainability. we do need to look more than just on governments and corporations and projects here or there. It does come back to the private sector looking at the supply chain all the way from production to the consumer, and it needs to look at the consumer to step up to make the right choices. I mean, we cannot keep that into the south space and some projects that we all finance, and for the poor, it will take everybody to step on board. And to not squeeze the cow any longer, I will not summarize it, and just will say thank you.
Maybe you can bring this microphone back there. Okay, thanks to the panel. I think we can all agree they've done a great job laying out the issues. Unfortunately, we're a bit short of time, but let's open up for at least some rapid-fire questions from the audience. Please, no more presentations, but quick questions. Floor is open.
Mr. Chairman, I have brought up population twice in plenary sessions, and I'm delighted that it's now been brought up on the platform. When I brought it up previously, platform speakers have told me they agree with me, and countless people in this audience have told me at the coffee breaks this is an important variable. And I think it's astonishing that we haven't talked about it in a more open way. We need to be population sensitive and family planning smart. Family planning is wanted, it works. You have taken pipes and seeds into villages. I'm the only person who's taken pills and condoms into villages. I did that in the 1970s in Thailand when people were having 6 children. Now they're having 1.8. The highest economic quintile and the lowest economic quintile, women have the same family size. I was not allowed to do that in the Philippines. In 1950, Philippines and Thailand had the same populations. Now Thailand has 66 million people, will have 61 million in 2050. Philippines has 90 million, it will have 150 million in 2050. Everything you're talking about in water and food will be swept aside. Family planning is wanted, it's a human right, it's low cost, it's well understood. We've taken the focus of family planning in Africa, and Africa is suffering. In the 80s, the fertility in Kenya was coming down. We took the budgets away, we took the policies away, the stall in fertility stalled, then it went up. There will be 12 million more people in Kenya in 2050, so the best demographer in Kenya says, because of that stall. There were only 12 million people in Kenya when I first went there.
Sir, thank you. I would love to also get a few more comments.
But you must have the courage, integrity, and honesty to put family planning in Nexus. Otherwise, Nexus is meaningless, and I would say immoral. I've suggested 2 sentences on the declaration. I'm sorry to be passionate, but this is so important, and I know many of you agree with me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we'll get comments from the... and thank you for your passion. It is a very, very important issue, and I look forward to some quick comments from the panelists on this topic. Please.
My name is Frans Verhagen of the International Institute of Monetary Transformation. And I have a question to the 2 people, presenters of IFAD and GAF. And the question is about local currencies and a global central bank. And I think this is really a nexus issue, because I think of the experience I've had with sustainable communities research, is that local currencies development brings people together, and they start thinking of all the strengths and problems they can solve with that money. So that is on the local level. And I was very impressed with the IFAD presentation there, because I would think you might want to put that in your agenda in terms of funding. Now, the other one is the global central bank. And you may say, yes, that is really far out. As a matter of fact, it's not so far out. And I've basically presented a possibility, an alternative for this in a realistic way that Maurice Strong feels to be innovative. So I want to have, and which is also a real nexus issue, because if people really start talking about having a global central bank where the different regional banks, regional monetary unions come together into one international monetary union, that is, of course, at the top of the scales that we have been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel for a very interesting selection of presentations. My name is Eckhard Kleinauer. I'm working for GRM Futures Group International. And my question is about integration and transdisciplinary approaches. And thank you very much for bringing it up pretty much in every presentation. And I came up throughout our presentations through the last 2 days. And I think to most of us, integration makes perfect sense on a conceptual level. What is missing in my mind here is the experiences, the lessons, the good practices of making integration work in real life. And I would like to know how the Nexus is going to bring the practitioners to the table. I think we have too many policymakers, researchers, but the practitioners are lacking. And also, how are we going to demonstrate that integration works, that it adds value? Integration has been around for a long time, but we are still lacking the lessons and the experience that it really adds value. Thank you.
In the meantime, of course, stuff just keeps happening in the markets. Please.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Mink from the Swiss Federal Office for Agriculture, and I have a rather short question for Mr. MacGillivray from IFAD. How is IFAD and the other Rome-based agencies involved in the process for the elaboration of the SDGs? And do the Rome-based agencies have a common proposal on targets related to food security and sustainable agriculture? Yeah, these are my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Iain, a couple of questions for you. Do you want to take them right from the bat? It will be turned on, so just talk.
Let me answer the first question. I think it was local currencies, and if I've got this wrong, let's have one-on-one later. I interpret this to be a reflection of domestic currencies, domestic support and commitment for what we do, but I may be wrong. We're surprised, and a lot of it is quite different since the food crisis, but country commitment for us is sine qua non. We can't work in countries where we don't have what we call the pari passus. Our loans can only go so far, our concessional loans. And on many occasions, in many countries, the counterpart commitment and investment by the countries where we work is greater than our own investment. So it's a demonstration of buy-in of their own investments for themselves. But I can't talk about creating a global bank. Really, that's more a banking issue. But certainly I'd like to talk to you about it later. On the interesting question about the role of the Rome-based agencies, for all of you in Rome, it's home for the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and IFAD. 3 of them were created for different purposes, have different missions, have different mandates, and have different governance systems. They all work on food. That's why they're called the food agencies or the Rome-based agencies. Now, to get to the question, on the SDGs, we are developing a specific targets and indicators in a joint effort related to sustainable agriculture, food and nutrition security. We will have this ready around the 20th, 19th or 20th of this month. We've been meeting since last year. And each one of us, because of our different mandates, in addition, but in consultation with others, we have developed different policy briefs on areas because our mandates are different. The World Food Programme focuses on humanitarian assistance. The FAO's focus is one of a normative role in terms of specific policy interventions at the country and technical assistance. And IFAD is a UN agency, but it's also an IFI in terms of its delivery. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Alexander and Astrid, do you want to comment on the question about population growth? Population growth? Demographics?
I'm a bit surprised.
Yeah.
Sorry, what
yeah,
was
no,
the question?
Population growth.
Population growth.
Yeah,
I understood it, and I'm a bit surprised because I thought, or at least I tried to make very clear that population growth is key if we want to assess how the future would look like. And it's
to the Nexus because it's a variable.
yeah, you're right. I'm agreeing with you. However, it's multifaceted. And if you look at population growth in countries where population growth is not happening, for example, in China, with the one-child policy, the Chinese delegation to the climate change negotiations 3 or 4 years ago said this is our major contribution to stop global warming, the one-child policy. And you should support us and not criticize us. But on the other hand, you know the debate, the global debate on is it allowed for a state to have such strict rules only to have one, you say, of course, others are of different opinion. And you have also a lot of problems if you look at the population pyramid, how the demography is changing. I've burned my fingers in FAO several times when I used the example of Ethiopia. Now, 85 million people, I hope you agree, and the business as usual scenario, the medium perspective is 180 million in 2050. And I raised the question, how will it be possible for this country to talk about sustainable development when there is an increase of 100 million people? The representative Ethiopia said to me, this is not your business. Why are you daring from the rich north to ask us to reduce our population growth? This is our business. So I had a similar experience as you had, and I still believe that population growth is one of the key drivers. But it's very difficult to address, and we should respect the countries. On the other hand, we should support countries to do everything that, for example, children can grow up without being hungry. We should invest there, and I think this is the best way to really reduce population growth in some of the countries.
Thank you. No, please. There are many others. There are other questions, and we need to let. Of course, it is important. But
Canada has the lowest total fertility rate in Africa, about 1.5 children, because women were respected and they had choices in family planning, contraception, and safe abortion. If you extend those choices to the rest of Ethiopia, you'll be solving your problem. But if you keep on pretending there isn't a problem and it doesn't have a solution, you are condemning people to misery.
But this was my argument. Unfortunately, Ethiopia didn't agree.
But the women agree, or they wouldn't be thousands of abortions.
Okay. I don't think there is a big disagreement, actually, in this room, that this issue is very, very important. We've also seen that, and this is something the MDG experience has demonstrated, that it is by investing in women and girls and making sure girls go to school and investing in maternal health of the whole spectrum of maternal health issues, that we can see when that actually happens, the birth rates start to go down, the family size starts to go down, and empowered women make empowered and good choices. And I think this is a very important issue, and we need to therefore carry that MDG legacy into the next framework. And you're totally right that the issues of the demographics and population growth are incredibly important. But we also know from bitter experience that it's politically very, very complicated to move the agenda forward. There was also a question about this business of integration. And I would like also maybe Astrid, do you want to comment on that question? How do we actually succeed in integration?
question also, are we succeeding? And it was a good question. I mean, I think from the GF, working on a basin scale, we're working on integration across countries and across sectors. And there's this whole driver of talking about benefit sharing, exactly bringing this integration around sectors across basins together. And we certainly, I can give you some of the, what we have pulled together and good examples and good practices. But of course, it is difficult. It's not that we would have found the key. It's not that it works everywhere. It's not that integration is an easy step to go forward. We have seen it work where you get countries long enough together to have a dialogue and seeing what the trade-offs are if you're not doing it, and if you don't have a choice. So if you look at, what is the evaporative loss around the basin, and where you have to put reservoirs in to come to irrigation reservoirs or get energy, and if the pressures on the resources are so high that you have to optimize it, you will get people together to look at that. We have seen it work out in basins that have a long history of cooperation. Like look at Senegal Basin. You find this benefit sharing key where they really had looked at costs and benefits from cooperation and put it in their legal agreement in the Senegal Basin, for example. So there's some of those that I'm happy to share and give you some publications. But I don't think we're far. I think we're still far away from having the.
Thank you. Do we have time for 2 more questions? Yeah, it's okay. I know there's a coffee break and we're eating into it. Quick questions, 2.
Okay, Mary Gilbert, Quaker Earth Care Witness. I want to bring up the question of international trade and the power of the trade organizations. I'm recalling Margaret Thatcher's famous saying of Tina, there is no alternative, as a guideline for thinking about the domination of these corporate influenced government decisions. How can we strategize? This may not be an answerable question. It may just be something I'm dangling in front of everybody. How can we strategize so that the support for smallholder farmers can be a possibility in the face of the land grabs and the heedless commercialization of agriculture, for instance?
Thank you. Please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Thomas Forster at the New School for Public Engagement in New York, and I've been working on the urban-rural continuum for a number of years. So it was actually wonderful. All the presentations were, but it was really wonderful to hear the links between Alexander's presentation and Iain's presentation, and it's the reference that Iain, you made to the very near-term target deliveries from UN agencies and others. You said March 20th. And I think the integrating targets, as opposed to targets, the integrating targets are the ones that fit the discussion here. And I'm wondering, for example, if you have developed any targets that actually could help operationalize what you described variously as the urban-rural nexus, the missing middle, that refers to the ag economic sector of the family farmer who's more than direct marketer, but semi-commercial or commercial that you spoke to so pointedly. And I wonder if the entry points are there for this kind of integrated target development in this very hot, fast-paced timetable we have.
Thank you. Who wants to take on the first question about trade? Who feels the calling? Alexander?
First of all, we should not make the mistake to think that all food is traded globally. It's only a share of it. And coming back to Iain's presentation, the bulk of the food in Africa is produced by smallholder farmers. They do not trade it globally. They have big problems having access to markets, and market development in Africa could really support smallholder farmers and could improve food security. But there's a growing tendency to trade food, especially the commodities. If you look at A country like China, maybe 10 years ago, they have not imported any soybeans. And now they are importing 80 million tons of soybeans annually. Europe is importing huge amounts of soybeans. And this leads to a situation, Astrid has demonstrated it, the nutrient cycle at global scale is very much linked to global trade. So the nutrients are mined in one part of the world, animals are fed in another part of the world, the manure remains, and we have a real problem with the nutrient cycle. At the same time, we are trading huge amounts of water. And sometimes there are very good studies. You can showcase that countries with water scarcity are exporting a huge amount of water because they are producing the wrong food for the world market. Maybe there's no other market, so things are really closely interlinked, but the bulk of the food is not traded at global scale. It's traded locally, and therefore supporting small-scale farmers could really increase or improve food security in these areas a lot.
Finally, there was a question directly to you, Iain, about the on targets.
Sure.
And on the rural-urban.
In the benefits of time, we have developed specific targets for these target areas. We've been extremely careful and cautious not to, and this is probably news to you, we as a UN agency are very careful about not promoting a goal that matches our mission and mandate. We're trying to be very careful that the discussions that are currently ongoing and that will get, in fact, more intense between governments, between what we call member states, that they are the ones who are actually having the discussions and putting forward their ideal target areas and goals. As a UN agency, we're being very careful about providing input to that discussion, but not promoting specific goals. The target area that the question referred to is leveraging the rural-urban nexus. We have identified 5 targets, as we have in the other target areas of my presentation, and I'd gladly share those with you, but clearly they relate to security of tenure over land, the first one. The second one, availability and access to productive and financial services. The third, connectivity between rural and urban economies through efficient and sustainable infrastructure. The fourth, building in rural-urban gaps. And the fifth, integrated, inclusive, and transparent governance of rural landscapes, etc. So we have, and then we found we're moving towards identifying indicators in those areas. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to ask now all of you in basically 1 minute to share with all of us what your thoughts are on the way that the organizers of this conference and the draft declaration have laid out the Nexus argument. Is that the way to go to drive this integration that we all feel so passionate about is needed to address the challenges we have across the different sectors and make progress on sustainable development? I'll start with you, Jesse.
I do feel like that's a little outside my wheelhouse as far as expertise, but one thing that I thought was fascinating with all the presentations I saw here today was the different approaches that kind of seamlessly integrated all of these different needs that are coming together all at once in the world right now. I mean, and I'm kind of seeing, as a reporter, I'm seeing that these things are not isolated, that each one spills into the other. And I think that's what's fantastic when I read the declaration here at Nexus, is that it is such an integrated approach. It isn't just this is in a silo and this is in a silo and this is in a silo. So yeah, from my perspective, I think that this is definitely a great approach.
Thank you. Astrid.
All right. I better preface that I'm going to be a personal opinion, not the GF, which I cannot ask quickly and all of that. I very much, and GF would very much subscribe this integration thought. You know, we are not having silos. We cannot afford to say, okay, we need more food, we need more this, we need more that. And working towards the MDGs, I think you're also coming clearly that there's a difference. You don't have that more access only, but you do not want to lose it either. You know, you have still the poor that do need more access to food and water and energy and so forth, and we cannot lose it. What bothered me a tiny bit when I was reading this declaration is we cannot easily lump and say, okay, we need more energy and it needs to be universal clean energy. And we need more water and it needs to be also sustainable more water. We will have sometimes here and there where sometimes not clean and perfect when it comes to the poor in the world getting access to basic services. I think what needs to be more clear for me in the declaration is that the SDGs will very much differ in actions and actors. I think in the MDGs we saw, you know, finance coming from the north, the actions having to happen on maternal health and on poverty, on water access and so forth in the south. If we want to come to SDGs and growth within boundaries, the actions have to be like in this room and have to be in Europe and then the US and then bigger countries where the middle class is growing and makes consumer choices and very much contributes to what is happening there on the planetary boundaries. Where's the food demand coming from? Where's the water demand after all coming from? So I think untwiddling that a little bit more and being more explicit on where the actors and where the actions would be something I would like to see in the declaration. Other than that, the integration is good, and I think we should use Paula's framework to move forward.
Thank you. Iain, do you want to add something?
Okay, first, I guess I would commend the organizers for making these extra efforts of bringing in different players, different partners, if you like. I think that's the way that many of us are trying to also behave in terms of making sure, and in many cases it would be ludicrous to think that we could do a lot of our, carry out our agendas on our own anyway, but that's the first point. I think second, I think it's clear, and I think it would be honest to say that capacity to do this is not always there. While we work with governments and we develop jointly with them a strategy and we develop then initiatives that are implemented over 5 to 10 years, it is that crucial initial exchange that can take sometimes a long time, where one has to address right at the very beginning, at the design stage, in the first exchanging, assessing what the context is, that it's critical for us to be able to bring to fore the Nexus issues. I've mentioned the issue of partnership, but the last one is one of scaling up for impact, which is one of our, if you like, hot buttons of where we're realizing that, and I think you referred to this, we have for many years, but I don't mention this so that you jump on me, but we have all focused on, with the resources that we have, we focused on projects. And we know that we have a micro-macro dilemma, which is how do we go from the small to be able to have impact. So one of our mission criticals is scaling up, and it's in the context of scaling up for impact that I think one has to address right at the very beginning what the trade-offs are and what the win-wins are.
Thank you, Iain. Julie?
Yeah. So I also really do appreciate the way this conference is set up and how all these different angles of the Nexus are looked at. And looking at the, and I think it's a good input into this whole discussion on the Nexus Declaration. And looking at the Nexus Declaration, I think what we missed a little bit was a bit more diversified picture. Because the standpoint was a bit strong from an environmental point of view, whereas we believe that there should be more also the issues of poverty and the need to provide food and certain basic services need to be integrated more into that. And that's quite diversified if you look across the world. So it's this balance between these different needs, which needs to come out a little bit stronger, I think, in the declaration. At the same time, of course, I do realize that, you know, if you want to make an impact with this declaration, it needs to be simple and clear. So it's, you know, it's this complexity which you're dealing with. On the one hand, this nexus, the integration, and you want to give this diversified picture, but how are you going to give some very clear messages which are going to have an impact on the SDGs? And it may be, as we have been discussing a few times over the last few days, whether are we trying to impact at the level of goals or are we trying to impact at the level of targets? It may be that that's where we need to look.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. Alexander.
I agree with most of what has been said, and I would only like to add 3 comments. First, repeating, let's not put a complete new approach on the table. This is not going to fly, but let's try to use the best possible proposal and showcase why Nexus is supporting it. And with this approach, we also avoid a situation which I have experienced several times, that all the sectors say we need more of the natural resources and the others should solve the problem. So let's not allow the Nexus to be an excuse for not acting in the sectors. Right. Second comment is, what I think is what has not been discussed enough here is we are talking about universal goals. These are not only goals for developing countries. So we also have to raise the question, what does it mean for industrialized countries? We are the main users of natural resources. We are the main emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. But let's link it to the right to development. We have to bring together development and environment. If we only look from an environmental perspective, and this is my background, of course, if we only look from an environmental perspective, we will come into a confrontation where we will not solve the poverty problems of this planet and at the same time not really turn towards a more sustainable way of dealing with everything on the planet. Number 3 is a question, what kind of science do we really need to underpin the Nexus approach? The current scientific approach was part of generation of the problems. I don't blame the scientists, of course, no way. But if we want to solve the problems, do we have to have both a multidisciplinary approach in order to understand what action in sector A has an impact in sector B? And do we have to go beyond to really tap all relevant sources of knowledge? There is a huge amount of knowledge in the farming communities. How do we bring it together with science? How do we enable farmers to deal in a modern way with the challenges they have to face without moving them out of business? This is my main concern, that when we are talking about innovative technologies, in the end this means moving farmers, small-scale farmers out of business and having bigger farmers. Therefore, a transdisciplinary scientific approach is urgently needed, because I think Nexus is a very nice word, but behind we are dealing with incredibly complex processes, including incredible complex social processes, with a very clear reference to the population question. Maybe you have a solution. I don't have any, but this has to be considered. And therefore, we need a different scientific approach in order to find out what has to be done. It ends up in the Nexus governance question, but this is the next conference, I hope.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the whole panel. Let's give them a big hand.